You are in my book playlist, and I am Daisy, your hostess. We have been going through the book titled The Book of Life by Upton Sinclair. We are now in part 4, the Book of Society, and we're ready to head in to the next chapter. If you're new to my channel, welcome, and if you are just discovering my channel at this video and would like to catch up with the first chapters, please do go to my book playlist and you'll have all the previous chapters there. And our Fortune community, welcome back. If you'd like to get started, please go to the description, hit that timestamp, and you'll be right there. Otherwise, hang out here for a minute as I share my narrator's comments. Well, I can say I'm not an economist, but sure, the author gave me a few things to think about with these last 2 chapters. In his chapter about the process of social evolution, I can say, and it doesn't take any genius, we are definitely a race that is a work in progress. The author mentioned that fear compels the race to grow. I would have to agree that in some sense, even today, I would say that it hasn't changed much. Even in today's society, I hear in the news about the fear of global warming, the fear of overpopulation. For the most part, it appears as we live in larger cities and in bigger numbers, we're not so worried about the natural enemies. In what I've seen in my lifetime, it appears that man is his own enemy. As the author moved on to the chapter of industrial evolution and started talking about those feudal systems with their pecking orders and privileges, it sounded very much how things are currently with those big corporations that seem to, in my opinion, control our industrial markets. Not to go off on any tangent, but perhaps some of you can leave your comment and share what you know about this. Let's consider the exchange we have here in the United States. Prior to June 1933, the United States used to have its currency backed by gold, hence it was called the gold standard. And coming off the heel of the Great Depression, President Roosevelt took us off the gold standard in order to fight off the economic downturn and also to avoid the people hoarding the gold itself. So it's interesting, I was curious to find out how much gold do we have in Fort Knox. Well, you can visit their website and there's like 147.3 million ounces of gold. And interesting that in 1941, we had 649.6 million ounces. What happened to all that gold? Where did it go? And then we have the Federal Reserve. And so pretty much they say that the Federal Reserve is not owned by anyone, but it's a board of governors, and they have 12 privately chartered regional banks nationwide. These privately owned banks make up our Federal Reserve. To do what? To provide the nation with what? Stable monetary and financial system. Who can say when more money is needed to be printed and when not, right? So between the U.S. Treasury and the Federal Reserve, we are in good hands, are we? Like I said, I'm not an economist, just someone that lives in the United States, that has given up my life to protect and serve as a police officer, that has served as a mayor for a city, and it's a wife and a mother, and watching the state of our country, and as many folks, praying that this republic system that we have here is one that is fair for all. But as I see it right now, we're back at where there is an elite few overseeing a group of other people with different grades and classes, with different functions and privileges and rights and duties. Almost sounds like that feudal system that the author was talking about. And when you have this many group of people that are beginning to see that maybe there's a flaw in the system, then maybe this is when you have elite groups trying to use fear to keep the majority subdued. And maybe they're afraid their tactics will not work until they starve you and use food as their next weapon. Have you all seen the price of eggs lately? All right, let's go on to the next chapter. Chapter 54, The Class Struggle, discusses history as a battleground between ruling and subject classes, and the method and outcome of this struggle. There is a theory of social development, sometimes called the materialistic interpretation of history, and sometimes the economic interpretation of history. It is one of the contributions to our thought which we owe to Karl Marx, and like all the rest of Marxian theory, it is a subject of embittered controversy, not merely between socialists and orthodox economists, but between various schools of revolutionary doctrine. For my part, I have never been a great hand for doctrine, whether ancient or modern. I am not much more concerned with what Marx taught than I am with what St. Paul taught or what Martin Luther taught. My advice is to look at life with your own eyes and state in simple language the conclusions of your own thinking. Man is an eating animal. He has also been described as a tool-making animal and might be described as an ideal-making animal. There is a tendency on the part of those who specialize in the making of ideals to repudiate the eating and the tool-making sides of man, which accounts for the quarrel between Marxians and moralists. All through history, you find new efforts of man to develop his emotional and spiritual nature and to escape from the humiliating limitations of the flesh. These efforts have many of them been animated by desperate sincerity, but none of them have changed the fundamental fact that man is an eating animal, an animal insufficiently provided by nature against cold and with an intense repugnance to having streams of cold water run down back of his neck. The religious teachers go out with empty purse and take no thought for the morrow. But the forces of nature press insistently upon them, and little by little they make compromises. They take to shelter while they are preaching. They consent to live in houses, and even to own houses, and to keep a bank account. So they make terms with the powers of this world, and the powers of this world, which are subtle and awake to their own interest, find ways to twist the new doctrine to their ends. So the new religion becomes simply another form of the old hypocrisy, and it comes to us as a breath of fresh air in a room full of corruption when someone says, "Let us have done with aged shams and false idealisms. Let us face the facts of life and admit that man is a physical animal and cannot do any sane and constructive thinking until he has food and shelter provided. Let us look at history with unblinking eyes and realize that food and shelter, the material means of life, are what men have been seeking all through history and will continue to seek until we put production and distribution upon a basis of justice instead of a basis of force." Such is, as simply as I can phrase it, the materialistic interpretation of history. Put into its dress of scientific language, it reads, "The dominant method of production and exchange in any society determines the institutions and forms of that society." I do not think I exaggerate in saying that this formula, applied with judgment and discrimination, is a key to the understanding of human societies. Wherever man has moved into the stage of slavery and private property, there has been some group which has held power and sought to maintain and increase it. This group has set the standards of behavior and belief for the community, and if you wish to understand the government and religion, the manners and morals, the philosophy and literature and art of that community, the first thing you have to do is to understand the dominant group and its methods of keeping itself on top. This statement applies not merely to those cultural forms which are established and ordained by the ruling class. It applies equally well to the revolutionary forms, the behavior and belief of those who oppose the ruling class. For men do not revolt in a vacuum. They revolt against certain conditions, and the form of their revolt is determined by the conditions. Take, for example, primitive Christianity, which was certainly an effort to be unworldly, if ever such an effort was made by man. But you cannot understand anything about primitive Christianity unless you see it as a new form of slave revolt against Roman imperialism and capitalism. The theory of class struggle is the master key to the bewilderments and confusions of history. Always there is a dominant class holding the power of the state, and always there are subject classes. And sooner or later, the subject classes begin protesting and struggling for wider rights. When they think they are strong enough, they attempt a revolt, and sometimes they succeed. If they do, they write the histories of the revolt, and their leaders become heroes and statesmen. If they fail, the histories are written by their oppressors, and the rebels are portrayed as criminals. One of the commonest of popular assumptions is that if the rebels have justice on their side, they are bound to succeed in the long run. But this is merely the sentimental nonsense that is made out of history. It is perfectly possible for a just revolt to be crushed, and to be crushed again and again, just as it is possible for a child which is ready to be born to fail to be born and to perish miserably. The fact that the Huguenots had most of the virtue and industry and intelligence of France did not keep them from being slaughtered by Catholic bigots, and reaction riveted upon the French people for a couple of 100 years. The fact that the Moors had most of the industry of Spain did not keep them from being driven into exile by the Inquisition, and the intellectual life of the Spanish people strangled for 300 or 400 years. Some 800 years ago, our ancestors in England brought a cruel and despotic king to battle and conquered him, and on the field of Runnymede forced him to sign a grant of rights to Englishmen. That document is known as the Magna Carta, or the Great Charter, and everyone who writes political history today recognizes it as one of the greatest of man's achievements, the beginning of a process which we hope will bring freedom and equality before the law to every human being on earth. And now we have come to the stage in our industrial affairs when the organized workers seek to bring the monarchs of industry into the council chamber and force them to sign a similar great charter, which will grant freedom and self-government to the workers. Just as King John was forced to admit that the power to tax and spend the public revenue belonged to the people of England, and not to the ruler, just so the workers will establish the principle that the finances of industry are a public concern, that the books are to be opened, and prices fixed and wages paid by the democratic vote of the citizens of industry. If that change is accomplished, the historian of the future will recognize it as another momentous step in progress, and he will heed to the protest of the lords of industry that they are being deprived of their freedom to do business and of their sacred legal rights to their profits as little as he heeded the protests of King John against the treason and usurpation and infringement of divine right by the rebellious barons. End of chapter 54. We will continue in this video to chapter 55. If you could be kind and help me with the YouTube algorithm, hit that like button. And now I turn the page to chapter 55, The Capitalist System. Shows how wealth is produced in modern society and the effect of this system upon the minds of the workers. In the beginning, man got his living by hunting and fishing. Then he took to keeping flocks and herds, and later by slow stages he settled down to agriculture. With the introduction of slavery and the ownership of the land by ruling classes, there came to be a subject class of workers who toiled on the land from dawn to dark, year in and year out, and got, if they were fortunate, an existence for themselves and their families. Whether these workers were called slaves or serfs or peasants, whether their product was taken from them in the form of taxes by the king or of rent by the landlord made no difference. The workers were bound to the soil, like the beasts with which they lived in intimate contact. They were drafted into armies and made to fight for their lords and masters. They suffered pestilence and famine, fire and slaughter. But with infinite patience they would rebuild their huts and dig and plant again, whether for the old master or for a new one. In the early days, these workers made their own crude tools and weapons. But very early there must have been some who specialized in such arts, and with the growth of towns and communications came a new kind of labor, based upon a new system. Some enterprising man would buy slaves or hire labor and obtain a supply of raw material and manufacture goods to be bartered or sold. He would pay his workers enough to draw them from the land and would sell the product for what he could get, and the difference would be his profit. That was capitalism, and at first it was a thing of no importance, and the men who engaged in it had no social standing. But princes and lords needed weapons and supplies for their armies, and the men who could furnish these things became more and more necessary, and the states which encouraged them were the ones which rose to power. Merchants and sea traders became the intimates of kings, and by the time of the Roman Empire, capitalism was a great world power, dominating the state, using the armies of the state for its purpose. It went down with the rest of Roman civilization, but in the Middle Ages it began once more to revive, and by the end of the 18th century, the merchants and moneylenders of France, with the retainers, the lawyers, and journalists, were powerful enough to take the control of society. Then, in the beginning of the 19th century, came the invention of machinery and of the power process. Capitalism began to grow like a young giant among pygmies. In the course of a century, it has ousted all other methods of production and all other forms of social activity. 100 years ago, the British House of Commons was a parliament of landlords. Today, it is a merchants and manufacturers association. Out of the 707 members of the British House of Commons, 361 are members of the Federation of British Industries, the labor-smashing organization of British big business. And the same is true of every other parliament and Congress in the modern capitalist state. Practically all the wealth of the world today is produced by the capitalist method and distributed under capitalist supervision, and therefore capitalist ideas prevail in our society, to the practical exclusion of all other ideas. I have shown in the Prophets of Religion how these ideas dominate the modern church, and in the Brass Check how they dominate the modern press. I plan to write 2 books to show how they dominate education and literature. 100 years ago, an industry consisted of half a dozen or a dozen men working under the personal supervision of an owner and using crude hand tools. Today, it consists of a gigantic trust owning and managing scores and perhaps hundreds of mills and factories, each employing thousands of workers. A corporation like the Steel Trust owns enough of the sources of its raw material to give it practical monopoly. It owns a fleet of vessels especially designed for ore carrying. It owns its private railroads to deliver the ore to the mills. Its system of dummy directorates. It has practical control of the main railroads over which it distributes its products. Also of banks and trust companies and insurance companies to gather the money of the public to finance its undertakings. Its own huge office buildings and vast tracts of land upon which the homes of its workers are built. It has a private army for the defense of its property, a complete army of cavalry, infantry, and artillery, including a large and highly efficient Secret Service department with a host of informers and spies. It has newspapers for the purpose of propaganda, and it controls the government of every village, town, and city in which it has important interests. If you will take the trouble to visit a steel town and make inquiries among public officials, newspaper men, and others who are on the inside, you will discover that those in authority consider it necessary and proper that steel should control, and are unable to conceive any other condition of affairs. If you go to other parts of the country where other great industries are located, you find it taken for granted that copper should control, or lumber, or coal, or oil, or whatever it may be. Under the system of large-scale capitalism, labor is a commodity, bought and sold in the market like any other commodity. Some years ago, Congress was requested to pass a law contradicting this fundamental fact of world capitalism. Congress passed a law, very carefully worded, so that no one could be sure what it meant, and a few years later the Supreme Court nullified the law. But all through this political and legal controversy, the status of labor remained exactly the same. There was a labor market consisting of those members of the community who, in the formula of Marx, had nothing but their labor power to sell. These competed for recognition at the factory gates, and highly skilled foremen selected those who offered the largest quantity of labor power for the stated wage. So entirely impersonal is this process that there are great industries in America in which 90% of the common labor force is hired and fired all over again in the course of a year. These men are put to work in gangs under a system which enables one picked man to set the pace and compel all others to keep up with him under penalty of being discharged. This process is known as speeding up, and its purpose is to obtain from each worker the greatest quantity of energy in exchange for his daily wage. In the steel industry, men work 12 hours a day for 6 days in the week, and then finish with a 24-hour day. If they do not work so long in other industries, it is because experience has proven that the greatest quantity of energy can be obtained from them in a shorter time. There are very few men who can stand this pace for long. Those who are not crippled or killed in accidents are broken down at 40, and all the great corporations recognize this fact. Their foremen pick out the younger men, and practically all concerns have an age rule and never hire men above 40 or 45. I shall not in this book go into details concerning the fate of the worker under the profit system. I have written 2 novels, The Jungle and King Coal, in which the facts are portrayed in detail, and it seems the part of common sense to refer the reader to these textbooks. It will suffice here to set forth the main outlines of the situation. In every capitalist country of the world, the masses of the people are herded into industries, in whose profits they have no share and in whose welfare they have no interest. They do not know the people for whom they work. They have no human relationship either with their work or with their employers. They see the surplus of their product drawn off to maintain a class of idlers, whose activities they know only through the scandals of the divorce courts and the luxury love of the moving picture screen. They compete with one another for jobs and bid down one another's wages, and if they attempt to organize and end this competition, their efforts are broken by newspaper propaganda and policemen's clubs. At the same time, they know that monopoly, open or secret, prevails in the fixing of prices, and so they find the struggle to get ahead a losing one. In America, it used to be possible for the young and energetic to go west, but now the wave of capitalism has reached the Pacific coast and been thrown back, and there is no more frontier. The man who works on the land has been through all the ages of a solitary man. He is better friends with his horse and his cow than with his fellow humans. He is brutalized by incessant toil. He lives amid dirt and the filth of animals. He is, in the words of Edwin Markham, a thing that grieves not and that never hopes, stunted and stunned, a brother to the ox. He is a victim of natural forces which he does not understand, and inevitably, therefore, he is superstitious. Being alone, He is helpless against his masters, and only utter desperation drives him to revolt. But consider the capitalist system. How different the conditions of its workers. Here they are gathered into city slums, and their wits are sharpened by continual contact with their fellows. The printing press makes cheap the spread of information, and the soapbox makes it even cheaper. Any man with a grievance can shout aloud and be sure of an audience to listen, and he can get a great deal said before the company watchman or the policeman can throttle him. Moreover, the modern worker is not struggling with drought and tempest and hail. He does not see his labors wiped out by volcanic eruption or lightning stroke. He is dealing with machinery, something that he himself has made and that he fully understands. If a machine gets out of order, he does not fall down upon his knees and pray to God to fix it. All the training of his life teaches him the relationship of cause and effect, the adjustment of means to ends. So the modern worker, as a necessary consequence of his daily work, is practical, skeptical, and unsentimental in his psychology. And what is more, he is making all the rest of society of the same temperament. He is building roads out into the country and building machines to roll over them. He is running telephone lines and sending newspapers and magazines and moving picture shows to the peasant and the farmer. So the young peasants and farmers hunger for the city, and they learn to fix machinery instead of praying to God. Such is the psychology of the modern working class, and the supreme achievement of their sharpened wits is an understanding of the capitalist process. As a matter of fact, they did not make this discovery for themselves. It was made for them by middle-class men, lawyers and teachers and writers. Fourier, Owen, Marx, Lassalle. The modern doctrine is called by various names: socialism, communism, anarchism, Bolshevism, syndicalism, collectivism. Later on, I shall define these various terms and point out the distinctions between them. For the moment, I emphasize the factor they all have in common, and which is fundamental. They wish to break the power of class ownership and control of the instruments and means of production. They wish to replace private capitalism by some system under which the instruments and means of production are collectively owned and operated. And they look to the non-owning class, the proletarian, as the motive power by which this change is to be compelled. I shall in future refer to this as the social revolutionary doctrine, taking pains to explain that the word revolutionary is to be divested of its popular meaning of physical violence. It is perfectly conceivable that the change may be brought about peaceably, and I shall try to show before long that in modern capitalist states the decision as to whether it is brought about peaceably or by violence rests with the present masters of industry. End of chapter 55. Okay, we're moving along here, and I invite you to head on over to the next video where I will be there waiting with chapter 56. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel.